Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined today by Terry Robinson, and we are going to talk about Digital Web 2.0 in this edition of Tomes of Magic. But before we get into it, how you doing, Terry? Anything on your mind today?
This is a very, I don't know what the adjective form of mage is. Magey, maguous, magetacular weekend for me. I am running 3 events for Onyx PathCon, Mage 20, and to spice things up, Mage 20. And I ran my first one-shot last night. I have run tabletop games for 15 years, but this was my first time where it's like, okay, you have 3 hours to jam rules for an antiquated system and a magic system that is about as intuitive as stereo instructions, and then to run a short adventure and hopefully no one will die. And neither the players nor the characters did, so I'm counting that as a victory. And I'm doing the exact same session 3 times, so hopefully that is more I get feedback and know what to do differently next time, and less I am bored to tears from doing the same scenario over and over again and being like, no, you have to steal the Jade Idol. But otherwise, I am doing great. In addition to that, we are recording now. I have an interview this afternoon, and then I have my table game over virtually on Tuesday. So I will be doing more Mage in this 4-day window than I think I normally do in the average month and a half, and I am not complaining. How about you?
So by the end of this 4 days, you're going to either be tired of Mage or you're going to be really into it.
Yeah. My Mage gland will be depleted.
Well, I'm feeling kind of happy because I got my print-on-demand first edition book, which I pulled it out of the package, and it was hardcover. And I was like, oh, yeah, Mage core book's hardcover. I was like, wait a minute. First edition was paperback. It was like one of those parallax moments. It's like, well, wait a minute. Oh, yeah. Well, okay. All right. The world is okay. I'm okay. I just had to remember that. In the original Mage core books, they used some printing technology to put sort of a shiny gold appearance to certain highlights on the covers, and they were not able to do that. And they had to substitute this dark, grungy green, which looks a little different, but I'm just happy because my original Mage first edition paperback is getting really beat up. Hasn't lost any pages yet, but it is looking really shabby. And so if it goes, in a couple of, any day here, then I've got a backup. So I'm just happy about that.
I remember accidentally buying the second edition of Mage in paperback. I don't know if I sneezed and accidentally bought it. It's not uncommon for me to not remember buying things on Drive-Thru RPG. I got it, and it was the paperback, and I had this weird moment that somewhere in a parallel universe, second edition had been produced in paperback, and there was a different Terry on a different Smage the podcast or something like that, opening a Drive-Thru RPG package where they pulled out a hardback which never existed in their universe. But yeah, I fully appreciate that moment where you hold a book that never existed in stores and you're like, whoa. So,
well, I think today we're ready to get into the topic at hand, and that is Digital Web 2.0. This is the second time that Mage the Ascension has wandered into the digital web. The book came out in 1998. It was written by Satiros Brucato and 5 others. On the spine, there is a number 21. That was a mistake. It should have been a number 22. This has caused a lot of upset. A lot of ink and electrons have been spilled over this issue. In fact, it caused so much ruckus that when Revised Edition came out, they didn't even put numbers on the spines. They just weren't going to go there. Years later, when things had kind of calmed down a bit, people were thinking more clearly again, they put numbers on the spines for Mage 20. But they use Roman numerals, not regular numbers, because the pain went too deep. And we do, here at Mage the Podcast, have the names of the people responsible for that gaffe, but we're not going to make it public. We do not want any reprisals by angry Mage fans. So just saying.
The thing I think is funny is even in the M20 continuity, we also had a numbering glitch where Book of the Fallen was supposed to be book 5, but it was printed as book 6. So right now in M20 it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. So numbering, not White Wolf's strong suit.
Okay, well, as we look at Digital Web 2.0, I would like to hear Terry give us an excellent walkthrough of this book.
I will give you the walkingest walkthrough of this book. It opens with a prelude that has nothing to do with Amanda Jensen, which was a little bit jarring for me. I just assumed that maybe her icon as a fish would appear, or suddenly she'd have to go to the digital web. But it's just a story about what the Great Whiteout was like. And apparently it sucked. And it's the story of a person whose icon is a fish talking with other fish, and then suddenly the fishbowl breaks, and you're like, wait, what? And then we get the introduction. It is a very brief section on what the digital web is, followed by a lot of painfully antiquated terms for various things. The number of words that end in Z for no particular reason brings me back to an era I never wanted to be in again. It is replete with definitions and such that I hope I never have to encounter again. Some of them have survived, like WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, or RTFM, read the freaking manual, have stuck around, but wouldn't it be nice if is one I have never encountered on the internet before. WIBNI. They explain what was up is, which I thought was useful. I'm like, oh, you're right, because I'm a 17th century time traveler and I don't know what words mean. And then we get into section 1, which is a walkthrough of the history of the digital web.
It recalls I've had many meetings in my software career where I'm talking about some mock-up or wireframe from a graphic artist, and I'm saying to everybody, this is a WYSIWYG interface, and somebody raises their hand, wait, WYSIWYG? What does that mean? What you see is what you can't have.
Oh.
that's always gotten a chuckle out of people. So I really like the opening line in the intro about this is a book about being there, and they put there in quotes, and you're like, what are they talking about? It's like, you're not really where you're sitting, and you're not really where the person you're talking to is sitting. It's some sort of a weird mutual space, and this book is about being there. And I sat and thought about that for a minute. It's like, actually, that's a really cool concept, because it's like right now I'm recording with Terry, and I'm seeing what's behind him, and he's seeing what's behind me, and I know that half of my room is not welded onto half of his room yet. Still, it kind of plays that visual trick on you. I feel like I could reach over and take a book off Terry's shelf or something sometimes. And so
I will cut you.
So that concept really appeals to me. It's like, you're not any place, yet you, in another sense, you really are somewhere. And so, but yes, on to section 1.
The first section is in character, call and response, question answer on the history of the web and kind of how it's organized. One of the things that struck me immediately is the IP addresses listed go up to 1023, where I'm like, wow, in the magic internet, address spaces are 40 bits as opposed to 32-bit. And I'm like, whoa. Yeah, and now we have IPv6, where I think Adam has like 1.9 trillion IP addresses dedicated just to him, because why not? That's what you get when you have 128-bit address space or what have you. But anyway, we get a history of the web, and the contrivance here is that in the process of communication over any media that creates a separate sense of place, as Adam said, the book says it's about being there. If Adam and I were on a regular phone call, temporarily, Adam and I occupy another space that is where the conversation is taking place. And that space exists both virtually and magically. It is somewhere out there in the Umbra or somewhere out there in the Tellurian, this other space where this conversation is taking place. This was brought first into existence with the telephone, but with Alan Turing's discovery of computational virtual spaces, we get the idea that there may be another space that you could actually inhabit. The problem is there isn't a lot of space in that space. So Turing had to come up with some sort of computational way to put himself there. During that process, he was killed. And this is one of the few cases of truly conspiratorial history where they say that Alan Turing did not commit suicide, but that was killed by outside agents. And either during that process or around it, his avatar maybe got shredded and may or may not be creating the entirety of the web. And we then get a walk forward of how a trinary computer, quote unquote, works, with the value of -1 representing maybe, which I think is probably one of the dumbest contrivances in all of Mage. And they talk about how the web used to be open and free and was full of tech nerds and was largely a outgrowth of military projects and so on. And then the bad things happened. You had the showdown at the OK Demise, where some crazy explodey event happened in the Spy's Demise, which was this very popular realm that we'll go over again more later. And then something happened at Derezzed and caused the Great Crash of 97 on November 10th. There was this 3-second shutdown of the web that killed hundreds and derezzed thousands, and that the internet is still very much recovering. But they say now the web is back up and running, and there are more mortals than ever, and it is no longer our plaything. More people have access to it, and doesn't this suck? The second half of this section is kind of on what the different types of spaces are in the web, and this will be first of, I think, 3 times in this episode where Adam or I give you a list of things, so put on your list pants. The first thing you have is unformatted or virgin web, which is this kind of gossamer cloud-like space that it's relatively easy to imprint it with whatever you want it to be. And the neat thing about the virtual web is a awakened or enlightened person has the ability to define the physics and rules of a certain area of the web. And that is why virgin web is so desired. The ability to force an area of it to contrive to your will, to whatever setup parameters, if you want everyone there to have to dress like a neo-noir detective, or to look like a robot, or to be an animated kitten, or to be a fish, you can do that. And that kind of freedom is something that web slingers are looking for. To connect bits of formatted web, which is web that has had a pattern imprinted on it, you have conduits. These are doorways or alleyways or pathways that somehow connect these two together. It is best to include those when it is being made, but it can be added after, which really makes no sense because a new sector connecting to an existing sector would require that existing sector to create a new door, and they never explain that, and so on. Sometimes a sector of web, such as during a crash or if improperly formatted, can become corrupted, and this is sectors of the web that are not fun to be in, and we get kind of rules on what they look like, but within the sectors there are a few different kinds. You have a grid sector, which is for sleepers, and it represents mortal institutions and trappings. So a mortal database or library will look like a literal giant library. A mortal chat site may look like thousands of people just at kind of dinner tables or coffee tables just talking to each other. A free sector, anyone can come and go. A restricted sector has limited access. And there are a few specialized ones which you don't necessarily have to go over, like junk lands that have been ruined but not as corrupted, or constrained sectors that have rules, or stack files, which are outbursts of positive emotions, or war zones or sex sites, or hung sectors, which I thought was a different name for a sex site, but we won't go there, is stuck in an infinite loop of some sort. And you have trash sectors, which are roiling seas of data, and it's just a long list. And then at the end of that, we get a little blip of what is referred to as the Matterhorn. Mount Koth, the idea of the correspondence point or the focus of devotion for the Ali Batin, was mentioned in Digital Web 1.0. It is de-emphasized in Digital Web 2.0, but they're suggested that there is this foggy, colossal mountain deep in the mist, and no one's quite sure what it is. Then we get a little bit about what the entities playing in the virtual web are and a bunch of ways to get there. And finally, we get a why are we doing this, which kind of fell flat for me. The idea that this could be another place where you can do anything you want and you can make it what you want and it has a lower barrier of entry, but mortals are ruining it. What did you think about Chapter 1?
I thought it was fun how it was titled Uncle Toad's Net Tour, which, if I'm correct, is a reference to the Toad character in the English book Wind in the Willows, who in the book was famous for buying very expensive cars, driving like a maniac, crashing them and risking his life, and then doing it again. I think it was like a joke about how this is a tour of the digital web, but I'm talking like it's a formal tour guide kind of tour, yet I'm titling it like it's a crazy crash through the web. I thought it was interesting that the Great Crash was caused by Doisatep's destruction, which I had kind of forgotten as a Mage fan when actually that happened and what actually caused it. And this was the start of the more, I guess you'd say, more detailed, or perhaps you could call it more deliberate metaplot elements in Mage being laid before. Of course, before this, Bricado as developer had a different approach to metaplot. It was much more open and light, and which I thought was fine. In Revised Edition, there's a more hands-on, direct metaplot story for Mage going. And of course, Jess Hainig is one of the authors for this book. And whether or not it was his idea, I certainly don't know. But it's just interesting to note that he was very much involved with Revised Edition. And here he is when the more direct metaplot is appearing. I noticed how it said that, Terry mentioned this, the sleepers are on the digital web now and they're messing it up, and isn't it awful? It says in here that as a result of what the sleepers are doing, there's more garbage lying around and fires. And I thought, wow, this is a very concrete representation of, mean discussions and nonsense sorts of conversations. And so I just thought, well, that's kind of making an assumption about how the digital web's technology actually plays out, and those assumptions could just as easily be different. But also the Great Crash, called White Wednesday and other names, seems to be a device to not only change the digital web and make it different from the last time we saw it, showing us how places in the game world can change over time, but also it seems to be a device to kind of shake things up and allow lower-powered player characters to have more of a direct hand in making new things in the digital web and influencing things. But that's my notes on Section 1.
I got the impression when reading Digital Web 1.0 that the whole point of that was to have a place that was easier for new players to get to, where you could have something that was like a sampler of the Umbra, but much safer and accessible. And now we have the easier to access version of the easy to access version. And we also get some information in that chapter on what the different conventions and traditions are doing there. This is really territory that you kind of already understand, that you have the virtual adepts who are there because this is a second chance to get reality right. The Society of Ether is there, and they view it as an opportunity to explore, that you have this weird mix of Dreamspeaker, Verbena, and House Thig, who in some cases are literally climbing into it from the cyber realm. We get the explanation of what the conventions are doing, and it's kind of what you'd expect. In Chapter 2, Site 2, Life Online, we get an overview of what the various communities are and how they deal with things. The key thing to being online is that you have some sort of icon, which is the representation of you in the web. That can be entirely electronic. That can be an actual representation if you're physically there, but you get to look like what you want to look like. And that one of the powers of the web was the fact that it allowed people, kind of regardless of other attributes, assuming they had the technical acumen, to find their people online. And Adam and I have both been involved in online communities for decades at this point, and the idea that the web is a place to talk about whatever you want to with your chosen people is reasonable, and a thing I wish the book actually kind of spent more time on. And they talk about within any community, once you get a bunch of people together, you're going to need some sort of conflict resolution system. And here they kind of present it as a case of your goal is to do something for a community to build up respect so that you kind of get leeway to maybe do what you want. And if it doesn't work out as it should, there are a couple ways of dealing with that. One is the idea of branding and rawhiding. And this is the idea that if someone does something really annoying, there are programs that you can run that temporarily or permanently modify their icon to kind of indicate their crime. This is the scarlet letter approach to the digital web, or tattooing S-hat across somebody's neck. Above that, since the digital web, this is a theme that I wish they explored more, since emotions manifest physically in the digital web, a heated argument will literally generate virtual heat. People in the digital web will see physical shows of the temperature of an area rising. And when people just start yelling at each other, a flame war will occur. When spontaneous bursts of VR firebolts will shoot back and forth and try and derez one of the two icons. More involved is the idea of a core war, which is a programmer hacker duel where you make one of the greatest roles in all of Mage, which I think is Avatar plus computer, or something like that, and you pit yourself against someone else. It's kind of like the Virtual Adept's answer to Kurdeman. We get some information about how you can present, in the sense that it is possible to be in more than one place at once in a process known as parallaxing, where you copy your icon and you can be in multiple places at once, and hopefully you have sufficient mind magic to keep track of everything. And that it is very hard to stay anonymous on the digital web because everyone has some sort of ID code. And the next section is the idea that a big driver of technology has been the idea that people want to get porn. So graphics was driven along by the idea that people wanted to see boobies, and that tactile technology has been improved because people wanted to enjoy the contact of their preferred gender. And then we get a section kind of talking about sleepers and how they're ruining everything. And we get an idea of what the groups are that you can find online. And I guess my biggest criticism was this section on the sleepers kind of created a fundamental contradiction in me in the book, where they say the digital web is powered by the quintessence of the people on it, in saying that when you're online for hours and your back hurts and you get a headache, it's not because you're hunched over staring at a screen that's 3 feet from your face and maybe you should wear prescription glasses or reduce the amount of blue light that you're getting. No, that is literally your personal quintessence powering a virtual place. Oh, okay. Well, if that's the case, then the billions of sleepers are the ones that are powering your digital web. It's theirs as much as it's yours. And you're just kind of being an asshole saying that you have more right to it than they do. It didn't strike me as any different than a lord saying, no, this is my forest. I don't care, peasant, if you provide me the food to live here and have the time to do it and actually do the maintenance of it and do all the weeding in my garden. This is my forest. Why would you think you have any claim over it? I'm like, geez, buddy, and you call the Hermetics jerks? That's that was just something that I don't know if that irony was intentional, but just the fact that it's like, yeah, it's the sleepers that make this exist. Why would those jerks want to use it? It just bothered me.
It's an interesting bit of world building in the setting of Mage, because, of course, in the first digital web book, there's no mention of where the quintessence comes from. It's a zone in the Umbra, and it exists on its own. It doesn't need help to exist. Mm-hmm. It's naturally there. And so now we're in late second edition, and in late second edition, they slowly by degrees introduced this idea that quintessence doesn't only come from naturally occurring nodes on the surface of planet Earth. It also comes from human activity and human passions. And so the digital web in this second book is powered by the quintessence it gets from people who use computers that are connected to the internet. I just want to say that when I was younger, I heard a lot of people complaining about being very tired after using computers that were not connected to even a local network. They were just 100% not connected to anything. Minor detail. I shouldn't gripe too much. But yeah, you've got the people who are powering your awesome place, and you're complaining that the people are there in your awesome place. It's like, yeah, if they all left, your awesome place wouldn't be so awesome. It talks about how sleepers can't be differentiated from mages in a lot of the digital web. And I don't think I understand how that may work, because the mages are connecting with VR, virtual reality gear, and they're interacting with the digital web in a way that sleepers are not. Now, we're recording this in the year 2020, and there are VR tools that people can buy and use in their own homes. However, the percentage of people using the internet today through VR is really quite low. In fact, most of the people using VR are doing, local console and local home computer video games more than getting on the internet through VR. So how is it that we can't tell the sleepers from the mages when the mages are using very different technology and interacting with the digital web very differently while they are there? I was thinking about that. Also, it kind of occurred to me how this book was written in 1998, and at that time, online culture was more, I guess you could say, private, more organic than it is these days. Nowadays, a lot of people's time on the internet is done through applications that are owned by corporations, and in chat spaces, social media spaces, etc. that are owned by companies. So the internet of our day is more corporate, less personal, less organic than it was back in 1998. But still, I can see how the digital web would be more organic and more personal than the regular internet. Even if we're talking about the digital web of the mages of the year 2020, their space would be more homemade. But talking about the prominent societies in Digital Web 2.0, I thought this was a great part of the book because in the first book, it says that there's a lot of people online, and isn't it interesting how the two main sides, the Ascension War, the technocracy, and the traditions, they talk and they mingle more online. And so that makes the digital web compelling. But they didn't give us separate societies. When it talked about societies in the digital web, it just said, here's the different conventions of the technocracy, here's the different traditions of the Council of Nine, etc. Now, here in the second book, we get separate societies, and those societies can include members from a lot of different factions in the Ascension War. First off, we have the Bogies, named after actor Humphrey Bogart, who was very active in the 40s and 50s. These are mostly technocrats and etherites. These spinners, web spinners is a term for mages who can function well on the digital web. These spinners imitate the look, the fashion, and the grace of 30s and 40s film noir characters. Although they may look like costume nostalgia buffs, the dramas they act out are quite serious. And just from my point of view, after watching 40s movies like The Maltese Falcon, Big Sleep, and Casablanca, I understand why the Bogies do what they do. I would not mind hanging out with some of these people. But moving on, we've got the Buzz Bombs, the NRKZTs, and the Turboprogs. These three groups support anarchy, and not surprisingly, their members often work alone. Buzz bombs are usually former virtual adepts or technocrats. They brew viruses and harmful programs on the digital web and cause massive damage in the regular world whenever they can. Considered dangerous to be around. NRKZTs are sometimes members of the virtual adepts and believe in more intellectual anarchy. They believe the balance must be swung away from stasis towards chaos. They engage in unintelligible speech, passionate appeals for anarchy, and the occasional crashing of financial systems. Turboprogs are the softest of anarchists. They engage in large-scale pranks that confuse but don't hurt people, such as turning every monitor in Washington, D.C. pink for a few minutes. They strive to push oddities in front of the masses to make them pause and consider the unthinkable. Next, we have the Crypt Keepers and FMs. These two groups are older virtual adepts who have become more set in their ways. Their abilities and influence are great, and they call for more order and cooperation. Crypt Keepers take the Ascension War more seriously and argue for stricter rules and less individual actions from virtual adepts. The FMs, which is Format Masters and other less complementary terms, are long-time programmers who advocate stricter coding practices, better cryptography, and more careful building in the digital web. I've worked with a lot of these people.
Yeah.
They regularly pour out scorn for people who take shortcuts or have less coding skills. Younger virtual adepts rebel against both of these groups. We have the Cybernauts, mostly Etherites, but also some Void Engineers and virtual adepts. This group is brave and dashing explorers who travel out to distant parts of the digital web to find unexplored territory. They take many risks but find virgin web and other rare treasures. They fall at an alarming rate to members of their own society eager to take their spoils. We have the Kolamites, named after designs done with white powder in India, which are really amazing to see. I've walked by a lot of them when I was there. Spinners who practice anarchy on a very personal level. They constantly shift their icons to appear as truly bizarre shapes and beings. They try to push their perceptions and interaction with the digital web beyond normal limits to find enlightenment. We have the Flesh Dancers, the Fuzzies, and the Raincoat Randys. These spinners, many of whom are cultists of ecstasy, use the heightened senses and different parameters of the digital web to pursue sexual practices impossible on Earth. We have the Gods, which is Godz. These are spinners, some AIs, and other beings that work at becoming digital gods. Their reputations spread as they work at keeping their names on everyone's lips. Some develop great power, but only in the digital web. We have the Rambos, capital R-A-M, reference to RAM on computers, fans of digital battles and strategy games. Many try to live up to the image of an ideal warrior. Some are modern soldiers, some martial artists, and others strategists. Most keep to fair fights and declared battle zones, but some try to turn any place into their battleground. And last, we have the rebooters. These groups work to repair the damage caused by the Great Crash and prepare the digital web for a possible great exodus from the physical world. Although some are treacherous, most are charismatic and civic-minded people who want to rebuild. And rebooters are not called rebooters. They have many different groups and societies that have their own names, but they get grouped under the umbrella rebooters. So that's our prominent societies on the digital web.
It is a weird mixture of thoughts. Like some groups, like the buzz bombs, the turboprogs, and the KZTs are like, we should use the digital web to change this aspect of meat space. And the bogies, the flesh dancers, the raincoats, and so on were like, this is the thing that we can engage in the digital web that we can't do elsewhere. So those two are kind of like orthogonal to one another. And then you have the crypt keepers, which are just kind of a view of the web, and the gods are kind of a view of the self. And then you have the rebooters that want to fix things. So it's not like it's a spectrum of any sort. It's not like everyone is viewing the web kind of as the same thing, which I go back and forth on. Oh, that's super neat. This shows me a bunch of different ways to view the web. But also at the same time, it's one of those things of like, what is a crypt keeper view of a fuzzy? So maybe a stereotype section or something like that, or a little bit of information on what they think about one another would be useful for me. I didn't realize that the term Colemite was based on a real world art form. So
Yeah, it was interesting because it's not only saying what are people's views of what should be done on the digital web, but it's also, to the reader, it's like a good clue of here's what people are doing on the digital web, and your cabal might get pulled into some of these activities or start something like this. So, but I guess they only had so much space.
We have Site 3, Sectors and Avatars, which starts out with a haiku that the number of syllables do not make sense at all. And we will quickly move past that. And it is called Sites and Sectors. And this outlines major places of note in the digital web, of which the first is the Spy's Demise, which is named after a drink at a bar that I think was frequented by a number of the White Wolf staff, or maybe had been near a place where Satyros had lived. There is some connection. Oh, shoot.
So you're talking about the name of Spy's Demise?
Yeah.
When we were doing the first book, which mentioned the Spy's Demise, I looked into this. It refers to a very early video game about spies sneaking around with other spies. And I think they liked that idea of people mixing together and being friendly, yet they had a hidden agenda while sharing drinks at the Spy's Demise. So it might be a reference to that early video game.
I think it is a case that video game is my guess is there's probably a book or a phrase called the Spy's Demise that inspired a video game that inspired a drink, and the writers knew the drink. So it's one of those things
Probably.
where there's probably a chain to it. So we have the Spy's Demise, which is a book named for a drink, named for a house cat, named for a martial arts maneuver, named for a car, named for a unit of measure, named for a video game. And the Spy's Demise is a neo-noir, kind of dark, smoky, people are still smoking, and it is a place to swap and trade gossip or talismans or quintessence, and it is a place that maintains its neutrality, and there is this person, Maxine, who sees that only the right people are able to get in, and if you don't have a passcode, you have to do something potentially embarrassing, and there is an arbitrary number of rooms in this place, and it gives you a list of kind of all the different places that you could theoretically go, and a number of characters that are frequently found there. Did you have a favorite part of the Spy's Demise?
I just like the general idea of the Spy's Demise. It's a place where neutrality is not only desired, but it is actually enforced. Mm-hmm. And it actually works better because no one really knows who owns the Spy's Demise. It's not like a virtual adept place where they say everybody play nice. Like, yeah, well, the virtual adepts are running this show. It's like, no, somebody is running this show, and it's been there a long time, and it is in fact very neutral. So we really can go rub elbows there with the other side, and we, for the first time, we get a little flat top view floor map of one of the main sections of the digital web, and I think that that's a nice resource for storytellers and players. It's kind of nice to put that in front of people and say, look, you're starting here, we'll take it from there. They have a list of characters you'll often see in the Spy's Demise, and a lot of those were carried over from the first book. There were a few new ones. I missed 23 and John Courage. They weren't even mentioned this time. It's like, oh man, I like those guys. One thing that really got me about Chapter 3 was they say, here are some other places in the digital web. They mention like 2-3 other places and then stop. It's like, hey, look, we've got a 133-page book this time. Give us some more sites or sectors in the digital web. You gave us very, very few, especially considering the expanded page count.
Yeah, it's surprising that literally they list 2 other locations. They talk about the infinite oddness of the web, and the 2 that are listed are kind of boring. You have the playground, which is a junkyard carnival weird place that just kind of reminded me of a creepy version of the Inventium from Beyond the Barrier Book of Worlds. And we get the New World Virtual High School Expo Center, which is a place for technocratic indoctrination of children to show them the technology is fun and attractive. And this kind of reminded me of when we were talking in Isle of the Mighty about the NWO Science is Fun Museum there, and they're like, oh man, the technocracy is really getting children by telling them that the world is an interesting place and that you can discover and learn about it and make the world better. Yep, they're really getting you. And you're like, wait, what?
Yeah. It was kind of funny that New World Order virtual reality school. It says it improves children's school grades, and that's proven. But boy, what an evil place! Like,
yes. And it
really
gets
all that evil,
and it gets them to eat their vegetables. It's menacing, and you're like, oh, okay. In addition to that, we get a few notable netizens. We get an update on Dante, a master of various things. We don't actually get stat blocks, which is relatively rare in second edition. We get a bunch of information that a lot of people are starting to view Dante as maybe a throwback or an old man, along with Roger Thackeray, the Primus of the Virtual Adepts. We get the Blue Meanie, who is likely a marauder on the digital web. We get Captain Feedback, which is a self-aware NWO program of some sort, and I thought these were interesting. I would have liked more characters. We get a few in the Spy's Demise, and they go into great background when maybe that isn't needed. But one of the things I did like is we get a rumors page, and this is something I always enjoy, when it just gives you a whole bunch of possible plot threads where it says that Derezzed was destroyed for this particular reason, that it was destroyed by a badass wizard who managed to survive Gilgul and execution, and he switched his avatar to the other realms for some payback, that werewolves have declared war on it, that the dream speakers are breaking in, and I like those. This is definitely a chapter where my main criticism is, normally I want more of less. This is a case where I wanted less of more. This is a new place that follows different rules that may not be obvious. Just give us 15 places and 20 people and a whole bunch of little ideas that a storyteller can run with. The ones that are presented here are good and useful. I just wanted more, and considering where some of the other page count goes, that is what I would have wanted.
I always like it when I see a really interesting marauder in a published mage book, because there are a number of marauders that really aren't my favorites. But Blue Meanie, they strongly hint that the Blue Meanie is a marauder, and I thought that was a very interesting take on marauders in the digital web. I'd like to use that. And of course, Blue Meanie is a reference to the animated movie Yellow Submarine from 1968, which featured the music group The Beatles. And that got me thinking. I remember watching that movie a few years back, and that movie used the flat two-dimensional animation, cell animation, to make to play with perspective. There were a couple of scenes where the characters would go somewhere, and the characters in the movie would look at something, and so they would show it to the audience. and then something would move in a way that played with the perspective and just kind of jolted your perceptions. And I thought, yeah, actually, that's a pretty good movie to recommend to mage fans to watch before they run something in the digital web, because in the digital web, the characters can go to a place and see something, and then you could describe how something shifts or something moves, and it throws their perspective out of whack, and they realize they're in a different place than they thought they were.
Site 4 is administration. And I think this was actually a computer glitch, because where you expect more information on the digital web, instead we get a lost chapter from the Storyteller's Guide. Where we get we get information. And mind you, this is perfectly good storyteller advice. The interrupted routine, the let the dog have his day, the troika method of developing an idea, I think were perfectly good ways of doing things. Just a quick overview there. A troika is the idea that you don't need to have a well-planned plot ahead of time. You just want to have a list that you can weave together as you need. So you want to have 3 distinct conflicts, 3 distinct storyteller characters, 3 distinct locations, 3 distinct background events, 3 distinct revelations that you can add to include in it. And then there are some advanced techniques on how to introduce mundane aspects to it, or sex or violence or puzzles or recurring threads or whatever you have to it. And that is a perfectly good method. When I run Mage, generally I will say, these are some set pieces that I would like to hit. These are some key themes that I would like to do. Here is a list of character names. I'm not sure at the time which one I'm necessarily going to use. And it was good advice. It was just weird to get it in digital web. The second half of the chapter is the techniques of damage control, which is basically some ways to use the web and some of the things that are unique about it. One is the idea of parallaxing, that a character can be in multiple places at once, and how to roleplay through that and what it means. Another is the fact that it's the digital web. Time doesn't necessarily make sense. It is a case where you can have a story where characters spend years dedicated to the digital web and lose touch with their mortal lives, or vice versa. They go on this epic large-scale adventure, they take the goggles off and realize that 15 minutes have passed. We get the idea that paradox on the digital web takes a different form and instead is a whiteout. If the digital web is a computer simulation and paradox represents a corruption to reality, a whiteout is a case where that corruption takes on the form of everything in an area slowing down and possibly no longer working computationally. And eventually it springs back up. The character still accrues paradox. They may be eventually kicked or punched off the web or what have you, but that is generally the form that it's going to take. And then the last thing we get in chapter 4 are the key themes of the digital web. And this is interesting because this feels like an incomplete list. We get a few ideas, but there are ideas that are presented elsewhere that are not included. One of the key themes they list is actions have consequences, which I would argue is a theme of Mage.
Yeah.
We also get the idea of the Great Race. And earlier on, they say the Great Race is no longer happening. And you're like, okay, that seems a little bit internally dissonant. Another one is the idea of paranoia and the omnipresence of technology, which is almost better suited off the digital web. And then finally, an idea of what is life like on the internet. And this is another case that maybe doesn't necessarily age the same way, because most of us have smartphones. We are almost always on the web in some way, shape, or form. The gap between the digital and the actual has, I would say, shrunk.
Chapter 4 has a really big section on storyteller advice, and it starts off saying, here's advice for being a storyteller on the digital web, but no, it's general purpose Mage storyteller advice. And it's good. I like the larger section on troikas, 3 things to, 3 of this, 3 of that. This should have been in Book of Mirrors, the Mage Storyteller's Guide.
Chapter 5 is the, for lack of a better term, it's the appendix. It's the system and crunch chapter, and it gives us a lot of information on general rules. It goes over travel, how to move from point A to point B. I like the fact that they talk about hot links. The idea that hot linking is this new phenomenon. It makes it sound like something scandalous that kids are doing these days. Like, kids today in school are going to the bathroom and doing some hot linking. We get another review of the types of sectors, and this is the chapter for me where the wheels really fell off the bus. This was a case where, okay, you've updated the book, we got some, okay. So one of the fundamental problems I have is if the web is magical in a traditional magical way, it is a discount version of the Umbra that just has more data on it. If the web is not magical, then the notion of paradox doesn't quite make sense to me. Like, if I were on a virtual service and somebody's head just exploded or something like that, that would not appear vulgar to me because I've literally ever played a video game. And the idea that something could be vulgar on the digital web that is just something that looked vulgar just makes no sense to me. Like the idea of someone making 100 copies of themselves. It's computational, sure. This makes perfect sense to me. Even things being large, assuming you have the computer resources, go nuts for it. Either you use the perspective of a sleeper, in which case the standard to me should be a video game or anything you've ever seen in a YouTube video, which is going to create a really high ceiling for paradox. Or it is mostly mages, and the fact that this is fundamentally magical should be just like being in the Umbra, where almost everything is coincidental because we're all mages here. Life and matter only working on solid bodies or objects, which kind of makes sense. I'm never quite sure how to feel about things, what I call sphere translation, where you say, oh, in the underworld, if you want to affect a wraith, you need spirit plus entropy or something like that. But then at the same time, you're like, okay, so you're telling me that the magical lens in no way changes what the spheres use. And then suddenly spirit, when you're in the Umbra, becomes the sphere used for everything because everything's spirit. And you're like, no, but you need these other spheres. And that may be a more fundamental criticism of Mage, that either the spheres are fundamental to the nature of reality or they are just a contrivance that mages use to keep track of things. And I would like some consistency in how that is done. And asking consistency of mages is messy sometimes, and I understand that. And we also get a weird cross-section of programs. We also get rules for hacking, which don't quite make sense to me because they talk about needing 10 to 20 successes on an extended roll that is resisted. And the odds of botching a roll like that completely skyrocket. Anytime you're making multiple rolls and you have a small dice pool for the individual ones, the odds of botching kind of increase. And if a botch on an extended action kind of destroys the whole thing, this is an awesome opportunity to generate huge amounts of paradox in a case where that's not supposed to happen, or to create huge botches. And I'm not even sure what that means for a computer system. Does like the internet just light on fire when I get like a 60 success botch? The systems and the game didn't quite line up. And that is a very hard thing to do. And I just didn't think this chapter stuck the landing.
A lot of things in there that you mentioned that were kind of odd. For example, it mentions how in these three spheres, if you have any knowledge there as a mage, then you can use it as one sphere higher. That was interesting, and it was nice to make the digital web different. We're talking about what is vulgar and what is not vulgar on the digital web. I feel like they didn't do a very good job of explaining what they were after. I got the impression that they were trying to say, we're not making this vulgar because it's unbelievable or pushing the boundaries of reality. We want to make it vulgar because it's an activity or a way of thinking that is against the nature of the digital web, and so this different place makes that sort of thing more difficult. I mean, I guess on a conceptual level, I can sort of understand that. I just wish it would have been explained better to me, if that's what they were thinking. I might be going out on a limb here. For example, it says you can use correspondence to basically teleport. They call it pop, but you can teleport from one place to another within a sector, and that's not vulgar because anyone who's on the internet, like people switch between rooms in a Discord server, or they go to a different server altogether frequently, very quickly, and this is just how people use the internet. And yet it says if you pop from one sector to another sector, that is vulgar. I'm like, why? Yeah. You don't even tell me why. You just say it's vulgar. Certain things become vulgar if they're not in keeping with the technology computer ideas of the digital web. And again, it's hard for me to understand that. There's one line in the book where it says, you can't explain magical effects that come from nowhere, and so those are vulgar and those get paradox. I'm like, well, define from nowhere on the digital web. I mean, you can have a wrist computer with a pre-programmed procedure, rote, hit a button or say a word and it pulls off wouldn't that look like from nowhere? In this chapter, they mention data viruses. They have viri, and they have what they call data viruses. And what they did not have, which I would have liked to see, was something closer to the concept of a digital virus nowadays, which is something that is in a program or an icon or a something else, and you don't know it's there, and it makes it work wrong or unexpectedly at certain points. It's like it would have been nice to have some mention of how to slip that kind of virus into something else and the rules to deal with it, but it wasn't mentioned at all. It seems strange that you have the digital web where it is a magical place where you have to have, enlightened will, you have to be awakened and use sphere magic, although, technologically, to make sites, to create sectors, to do all kinds of things in the digital web. And then it says here, the hacking rules, when someone comes into a sector or room or whatever in the digital web, you can add a backdoor that wasn't there before, or you can heavily modify it, or you can just rip it up and make it crash by using straight computer skills. And that doesn't sound right to me. As a Mage fan, that doesn't sit well with me. I'm going to come into this sector that was created with sphere magic, and if I make the right rolls, I'm going to crash it. Why aren't sleepers tearing down sectors all over the digital web? And Terry mentioned the actual dice mechanics they have for doing this hacking, and yeah, I agree that does make it very difficult. I think they were trying to reinforce the idea of sectors don't get pulled down every 5 minutes because it's difficult by the dice, but on another level, it seems like in the second edition core book, you have this idea of if you make a good skill roll, that will make your arete roll for magic with a lower difficulty or, the potential for doing a better job of it. So what if we were to use something like that here? You make a computer skill hacking kind of roll, and if you do a good job, then you can do an arete roll with forces or correspondence or whatever to add a backdoor or tear down the sector or something. Yeah, to make a long story short, if arete is used to make it, then arete should be used to break it or change it or mix it up.
Yeah, if it is magical, like Adam and I fully understand that if I use a roll to use matter and prime to create a stick, that a non-mage can break that stick. But this seems to be a case where the liminal nature, not quite magical, not quite mundane. I like that as an idea, but I don't know if systematically it stuck the landing.
Yeah. Well, before we walk away from Chapter 5, this is probably a good place to talk about the ways to enter and the ways to get kicked out of the digital web, because these are mentioned a number of times throughout the book. There are three main ways to enter. There's sensory visitation, which is also called telepresence, and that is basically putting on what we recognize as a real-world VR rig, although there would be gloves that go over your hands to more accurately register how you're moving your hands. But basically, you can see and hear what's in the digital web. You can move your hands around and interact with things, but you are still sitting in your living room at home, and if there's a loud noise in the next room of your home on Earth, your real ears will hear it, and if someone walks up and pokes you in the shoulder, you feel that, and you'll take off your VR goggles, and you'll say, "What's up?" So that is good because it's the lowest risk. If some bad stuff happens to you on the digital web, then you wake up at home and you're not hurt. You're okay. But also it gives you a -2 on a lot of skill checks and rolls and perception checks and stuff on the digital web because you're less present than other people who are there. Next is astral immersion, which of course they're going to use different terms if you're a virtual adept. But basically you are using mind magic to really make your mind be in the digital web and not at home. And so you don't get the minuses, you can see and hear things better, you can more easily interact with things that are on the digital web. Your body back home is insensate. If a bad guy wants to, get you, then your body can't react, it's in trouble. So there's some risk there. Also, another area of risk there is when you get kicked off the digital web, it's easier for you to get actual physical damage or confusion or some harm that way, but not real serious. And the last is what we call holistic immersion, and that is where your body is not at home. It is not there anymore. It is really in the digital web. And of course, a lot of us have seen the old 80s movie Tron, where there's this big, special machine that zaps a guy and his body is not there anymore. It really is in the computer of Tron. It is the best way to really feel and perceive and interact with everything in the digital web. It mentions that there are some cultists of ecstasy who use holistic immersion to go in and do their amorous activities, and they get much more sensation and memorable experience out of it. But also, holistic immersion has the greatest risk. If you are attacked in the virtual world of the digital web, you really are attacked. You really do take that damage. And if you get hard dumped out of the digital web, then you might die. So that's something to think about. But there's a benefit in holistic immersion. Your physical strength, your physical dexterity are there for you to use. So if you have a high strength or dex, then they are yours in the digital web, whereas the other two methods, you have to take mental or social attributes and use them instead of your physical attributes. So going on to ways that you can get hurt in the digital web, there's 4 main methods of getting hurt in the digital web. There's a soft derez, which is short for like de-resolution. It's like you basically disappear. You're not there anymore in the digital web. You get pushed to a different place in the digital web. People who play video games know about spawning points. They know all about this. It doesn't really hurt you. It just makes it so that you drop everything you're holding and you reappear somewhere else, often not a place that's very helpful to you. There's a hard derez. That is where you get pushed through your connection back into your physical body and you are not on the digital web anymore. And sometimes you can get some physical damage and some minuses to your attribute checks and stuff from that. Next up, we have icon death, which is like hard derez. Yeah. Basically, your icon on the digital web, your digital representation of yourself could just get totally shredded and destroyed. But you're probably still going to wake up at home, but you have more damage, more minuses to your skill checks, etc. And so that's a bad thing. You don't want that to happen, but you're probably going to survive. Last is called chaos dump, which you probably will not survive. In chaos dump, your link back to your physical body is cut, and your icon and your mind are thoroughly scattered. They're all mixed up, usually permanently. So it is kind of like experiencing death, and you keep experiencing it forever, and you never go on to the afterlife, which sounds pretty frightening to me. And it's hard to make another person on the digital web experience chaos dump, but it can happen, especially if you go to restricted sectors. And it says a couple of times that the technocracy is famous for visiting this on people that they're trying to get rid of. So yes, there can be permanent harm in the digital web, but it's not as common as other methods.
We also get whiteout rules, which is how Paradox works. And this is kind of interesting because, like, you can ag someone with Paradox. Like, a Paradox roll where you get 7 or more successes can, like, crash an entire sector. So this is one of the few cases where you can use Paradox seemingly offensively. And they make specific reference to, don't let your players use Paradox offensively. And it's like, well, then why did you have Paradox rules like this? Like, I'm always thrown off when the game's like, these are the rules for this, but don't let players do this one specific thing, because a guy and I talked about it once and a player was a huge jerk about it and he blew a hole in my poorly thought out plot. Okay, and now suddenly we have this rando rule about it. Like, oh, okay. And holistic immersion for when you really want to sleep with a spreadsheet. And I guess my last thought on systems is like, oh, with holistic immersion, it also creates a weird interaction with the rules. Like, if you do the skill translation and then in M20 you use mind 1 to increase your wits or perception or something like that, or intelligence, you're like, okay, so with mind 1 I can become internet jacked. You're like, okay, that kind of works out. But these are the weird places you get when you try and offer comprehensive rules for these kind of things. We also get gauntlet rating, because sure. And then finally, we get advice on running in the real web. So running the digital web on the interweb. But I think the most interesting thing to me in here was looking through the books section where you get the standard resources. And it says, hey, look at these other books. But Mike Pondsmith and the crew at R. Telsorian, Cyberpunk 2020. And you and I are recording this in 2020. And the world is not very cyberpunk. Thank God. And that's really kind of my closing comment about that. There was a recent interview with Mike Pondsmith, and it was like, yeah, cyberpunk was not aspirational. You shouldn't be angry we're not living in that world. I'm like, yeah, that's good.
Yeah, Cyberpunk gets remembered years later as, oh, look at all that cool tech. It's like, no, no, wait. Seriously, the
How about
movies
the
and the
corporate
books
dystopia?
actually pay attention to that. The characters in that setting were miserable because the world sucked. Don't tell
Yeah.
me you want that.
Yeah, I don't want to be like Roland Deckard. Like, I would like to have a rich inner life surrounded by people I love. Like, oh, I want to do something gritty noir and have a weird gun and shoot Roy Batty. I'm like, that is not on my to-do list. That is maybe me as a boring person in their mid-30s.
It talks about how to go on the internet in 1998, and of course, yeah, this is so dated that to criticize it now wouldn't be reasonable. And yet, there is one point that I will bring up. It talks about how to play through email, how to play through MUDs, MOOs, etc., and a few other things. But one thing they did not mention was that the time this book was written and when this book hit the shelf, there was a software application being used by people called Palace, and it was visual chat. So you could not speak, through a microphone and hear other people in that way, but you had to type with text. But this software application divided up a site into different rooms, and every room had a JPEG or a GIF image that the user could set in there. It had it set up so you could declare people as basically as storytellers, and they could set up rooms and they could put the graphics in there. And you could, everyone was represented by a smiley face, and you could change the expressions on the smiley face, but you could also enter in your own flat two-dimensional raster images and put them over yourself. And it was a grid of 9 squares, so you could have a little square, or you could have a 4-square bigger one, or you could have 9, really big. And you could also have 2x3 and 3x2. And so you could take any image you liked or made with Photoshop and just drop it in there and represent yourself that way. And there were actual keys you could hit where you could instantly change your own image from one to another. And it was really handy. And you know what was interesting about the Palace visual chat software was White Wolf Company itself in the late 90s set up their own Palace site for role-playing White Wolf games. And I was on there. I was running Mage, and I was playing in Changeling and Werewolf games and stuff, and it was a lot of fun. And it was White Wolf's official Palace chat site, and it's not mentioned in the book. And that actually doesn't surprise me because I talked with the low-level web guy from White Wolf at the time. He said, yeah, even people here in this office don't know about it. It's like, yeah, no kidding. You wrote a chapter about gaming online, and you didn't even mention your own company site. I just think that's hilarious.
The Palace as a computer program still exists.
Oh, it's still around?
Yes, it is something that you can download and apparently use. I used the one for Decipher. I was a fan of the Star Trek and Star Wars collectible card games, and I remember using those and the terrible rendered 3D background images that were available at the time where it's like, you're outside of a mansion. You're like, wow, look at that incredibly rectilinear shadow. It's so advanced.
It was fun to use in 1998 because I could hit 2 keys on my keyboard and my icon would change from one image to a different image, of a character. And so when I typed, the text would appear as a word balloon next to my little visual icon. So as a storyteller, I was switching between NPCs. And so when the players saw my picture change, it's like, oh yeah, it's that NPC. And so there'd be a word balloon right next to me. And so gameplay flowed really nice. And back in 1998, that was pretty sweet.
Yeah, the Wikipedia article has a list of other Palace clients and incompatible Palace-like clients. And I'm like, yes, of course this immediately forked the moment the public got its hands on it. And then one day, eventually, we would get Second Life and so on and so forth as the precursor. So I guess for the book overall, one of the first notes is this book has a distinct visual style to it. It uses a somewhat different visual language than most of the other books. We don't get much John Cobb. We still get some Leif Jones, but this is the, I think, only Mage cover that is done by Bill Sienkiewicz, who has a pretty distinctive visual style that I love, was big behind the old X Factor comics. I did like generally the art in the book. I thought it was an interesting mashup of styles, and Rich Thomas always commented on the fact that he thinks it is important for a game to have a lot of artists because different players will respond to different art styles, and to make a game available to everyone, we need to have a bunch of those different styles. There are a fair number of pieces where it's distorted text or visual overlays or something that I think do a good job of conveying the idea of the digital web. I would have liked any sort of representation of what it's like kind of inside of a sector or between sectors. This book still fails to answer the question, so what does the web just look like? They make mention that high-level correspondence will allow you to kind of look outside of things, but that is kind of only a temporary thing, and you have to be super good at it. And if everything is a sector or a conduit, then how would you ever find Virgin Web unless you just had this high-level correspondence magic, which maybe is the point, but that's another part where things kind of fell apart for me.
Yeah, they could have mentioned it.
The PDF is a dumpster fire for this book, to use the highly technical web term. It looks like somebody grabbed it off of a internet pirate site. Like, the fonts are wrong, the titles are misspelled in a number of places, there is no border. So maybe we cross our fingers and ask Drive-Thru-RPG nicely to update it.
For some general notes for me, it mentions in one place that corrupted web after the White Wednesday Great Crash, it's staying around for a really long time, and it's really risky and difficult to fix that situation and get it back to usable formatted web. And it's like, I'm reading this, I'm thinking, well, why? I mean, how is it like that? Because, on the real internet, when you've got a bad server or a bad placing is like a snap. So I can understand that the digital web is different than the real world internet, but tell me why? Tell me how? I mean, give me a little something here. Don't just say it's hard and then move on. AI's artificial intelligence has got a few mentions in this book. We are aware that they are in the digital web, but very little mention. The first book did a better job of showing them more, talking about how they're different from human beings, how they chase after different things than human beings do. For example, there's the hen of Graincarn or something was in the first book, and it got a big write-up. And in the second book, it's mentioned in passing twice, but that's it. And the hen of Graincarn is interesting because it's not a human being. It is a sort of AI program that may have developed accidentally, and it serves as like an oracle that dispenses wisdom. And 75% of what it says is true, but 25% of what it says is absolute nonsense and false information. And it says in the first book that AIs come to the hen of Graincarn and they respect it deeply as some great wisdom. They listen to everything it says, but humans know that the hen of Graincarn is wrong a lot of the time, and so they think it's just a screwy goofball thing. And so it shows how the AIs and the humans are doing things differently on the digital web in the first book. But here in Digital Web 2.0, there's very little mention of AIs, about how they're different, about how the digital web is different because they are there. And so that took some of the magic out of it for me. I say that technomancers who are working the digital web, they use programming languages that don't exist in the real world. They are technomage created programming languages. They're not using C++ or JavaScript or Java or Python or et cetera. There's so many. They have made up their own. And I even go so far as to say that on the trinary computers and the decks that technomages are using, there's a handful of keys that have symbols on them that are not on regular sleeper keyboards. And so they use those special icons when they are writing their code to write code that cannot parse for sleepers. And this is why sleepers are not stealing the rotes that are programmed by virtual ADAS, because when they steal them and they try to run them anywhere, they get junk and they say, some idiot teenager wrote this, and they delete the file. And that is how you keep that line between technomagic and sleeper regular technology.
Yeah, just like they use a larger address space than was available at the time to suggest that there is more web out there. They have the super shift key.
Yeah, or they'll have some key on the keyboard that's some weird squiggle line. And they'll say, you pronounce it like this. No, you pronounce it like that. It's like, okay, that's the internet I know.
Yeah. Oh man. I don't know if it would be the coolest thing or the dumbest thing ever to have a keyboard that had just like a prime key on it. And now I really want that and don't at the same time. I guess a correspondence key would be pretty cool. No, I have some custom keycaps that I want now.
So that you can do leet coding.
Yeah, exactly. I don't even use ones and zeros. I use L's and O. So it's just like la, 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 la. Anyway, to jump off of that, there are three places where you can say this is mostly magical, this is mostly mundane, or it's a mix of those two. And I don't think it picked a lane. And for me, narratively, as a storyteller, I want it to be one of those, or I want to have options. Here, it kind of leapt around between mages can make it, but mortals can hack it. But this thing is fundamentally magical, but this is going to be vulgar, even though there's sleepers. There aren't sleepers there, and this is not the same as other realms, but because of the whiteout, these sectors couldn't be reformatted. I don't feel as a storyteller I had enough information here that if I was hit with a novel scenario, I could tell a player how it would work and come up with a solution that is consistent with the rest of the book. I don't need a book to tell me how to do everything, but to me, a good system will be thorough and consistent enough that if it encounters something novel, you will have an idea of how to extend the system to include it. I am used to more modern games where you have more toolbox systems that kind of let you roll your own if you need to, and that have a unified design vision that make that easier, and that's not here.
One thing I will say, if I was, as a storyteller, going to run some sessions in the digital web, I would want to have both books and read them both, and then I think I could piece things together and do my thing. But if I had only digital web 2.0, I would have a harder time as a storyteller.
Yeah, I almost like Digital Web 1.0 because it presents a weirder and wilder web with these odd things, and I really appreciate that 1.0 aesthetic to it.
I do too.
I am kind of curious what this book would be like if we had a data sphere, like if that had existed then. And it makes me curious about one of the things that was possibly going to be part of the next Kickstarter, or was possibly going to be released as part of the M20 line, was Digital Web 3.0. And I'd be fascinated to see what that looks like. But at the same time, one of the problems that we've got is the writers are only allowed to deviate from the canon so much. And I think at this point, I would want a pretty large departure from what's been established so far. So it's almost one of those things where maybe I'm okay that we don't get a Digital Web 3.0, because it wouldn't be what I'd want it to be anyway.
Well, if I remember correctly, they did so well with the large number of people jumping on board that, if I remember correctly, there was some mention of doing a PDF-only Digital Web 3.0. I could be wrong on there, so we'll have to keep our eyes open for that one. Well, to round out, I've got some adventure ideas for the digital web, and then we'll bring it to a close. Hopefully, Terry will have a really cool quote for us at the end. Okay, first off, rumors circulate in the spy's demise that the technocracy is reclaiming corrupted web at a rapid pace. A wounded crypt keeper, that's an older virtual adept, passes the players a message to carry before he derezzes. The technocracy has finally perfected techniques to raise children from infancy inside the digital web. These prodigies, nicknamed the spinnerets, have phenomenal abilities and created a new kind of data beast to repair corrupted web. If the adepts can examine this new data beast, the technocrats won't dominate the digital web. The message's recipient can't be found. Are the players brave enough to follow the info and confront the spinnerets? The spinnerets have very high abilities and primo equipment. However, because they're so young and impressionable, they're willing to talk when others wouldn't. An opportunity for a storyteller to emphasize brain over brawn. Also, a chance to plant seeds of rebellion in the technocracy's wonderkins that might blossom in future stories. Number 2. Rumors speak of a newly discovered conduit to the Sears Library. A friend of the players chats excitedly about how she's going to soon see the Tellurian's largest repository of knowledge. Later, the players notice her mood has changed. She talks about how she's seen the true heart of the digital web. When pressed for details, she only makes emotional arguments about how the web is being threatened and says her insights are too deep to talk about. She joins a new anarchist group called Shiva's Altar Boys, involved in a secret project on the edge of the web. Clues indicate the Altar Boys are up to something big, and their membership swelled overnight with spinners that would never work together. These same spinners all said recently they wanted to check out the Sears Library. Where does this new conduit really go? What is the anarchist group working on, and who's pulling their strings? Number 3, rumors of the Fractal Architects, a new group that entices virtual adepts and void engineers to join, are heating up. Some say they have discovered a new protocol that opens up tracts of Virgin Web. It would certainly explain why so many high-profile spinners aren't around anymore. When the players go to investigate, they see the Great Race has amped up on the fringe of the digital web. New floating sectors are being built and fought over by different factions. This far away from populated sectors, spinners must create their own resources like conduits, secure quarters, and equipment. The players are accused of spoiling Virgin Web, but learn it's a ruse to divert attention from the Fractal Architect's latest plan. Can the players clear their name on this frontier where their technical skills are pushed to the limit? Finally, some rough ideas for a chronicle in the digital web. The Ali Batin have known the zone the digital web exists in for a long time. The Batini mages talented enough to work in the zone tolerated the techno-mages' incursion because they were few in number, and the techno-mages only worked in part of the zone. However, years have gone by and the digital web is growing. As it grows, it locks down more and more of the zone into strict pattern. This will cripple a vital part of the Tellurian if allowed to continue unchecked. The few Batinis who are tech-savvy created a secretive society in the digital web called the Sublime Null. Too small to shut down the technomages on their own, the Sublime Null ushers in djinns and other Umbrud who take on the appearance of data beasts and work against the foundations of the digital web. When the players uncover the truth, will they agree that the digital web is a danger to the world and must go? Or have the Batinis misunderstood the metaphysics of the correspondence zone? Well, that's all I've got for adventure ideas.
Your rough ideas are better thought out than the actual ideas I use at my table. So I would just like to note that for the record. When you're like, here's a rough outline and all the details and all the character names. So my quote, put on your quote pants. This is from, I can't tell you the page number because the PDF doesn't include the pages, but it says, while the idea of sending a group of magi into channels like pound, exclamation point, 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 equine underscore incest underscore sound file hyphen trading underscore Winnie underscore nay underscore moan exclamation point or alt.sex.cthulhu in order to beg for vital information can be amusing all by itself. The motives of those who spend a lot of time on the web can be mined for some very serious and very disturbing character-driven stories.
I can't match that. That's awesome.
So what are we reading next, Adam?
Next up, we're looking at the Orphan Survival Guide. That's 130 pages, and so that'll give us a really good view of the orphans. I'm actually looking forward to that one. So I think at this point, are we ready to wrap things up?
Yeah, I think we're ready. I think we're ready to wrap.
Okay, well, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other channels. If you like the show, others might like it too, and if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible to their searches. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com, where you can listen to every episode we've got and the complete show notes that we provide for you after we finish editing these episodes. This episode is thanks to executive producers Ira Grace, Richard Batt Brewster, Michael Magnuson, Bryce Perry, Brendan Morrow, Andrew Katz, Michael Parker, Anders, and Justin. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. And on that note, thanks everyone for listening to Terry and I go through this 1990s book about Mage. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Bye.